My son called an emergency family meeting to discuss what he described in the actual text message as some concerning changes. I want you to understand who's telling you this. 30 years as a fire captain, a man who ran command on some of the worst structure fires this side of the Mississippi without so much as raising his voice. And my own 41-year-old son sat me and my wife down at our kitchen table like an intervention counselor, working from a list on his phone, genuinely convinced his father was having a midlife crisis. I read that text message twice standing in our kitchen, Barbara looking over my shoulder, both of us genuinely puzzled for a solid minute before either of us could stop laughing long enough to actually respond to him. I want to walk you through exactly what was on that list, why every single item had a boring, practical explanation, and how a man who spent his entire career being the calmest person in any burning building ended up being treated like the reckless one in his own kitchen. If you're new to this channel, subscribe, because I tell the real, occasionally hilarious version of these stories every week. My name is Donald Foster. I'm 64 years old, and I spent 30 years as a firefighter, the last 14 as a captain, running a station in a mid-sized city outside Cincinnati. If you know anything about fire service, you know it's a profession built entirely around procedure, checklists, calm, methodical decision-making under conditions that would make most people fall apart entirely. The kind of training that becomes so deeply ingrained it eventually governs how you approach every major decision in your personal life too, whether you notice it happening or not. I remember one call in particular, a warehouse fire in my 9th year as captain, 4 alarms, structural collapse risk high enough that I made the call to pull my crew back with less than 90 seconds to spare before the roof actually came down. A decision I made calmly, based on training and read conditions, not instinct or panic. That's the specific irony of this whole story, that a man whose entire professional reputation was built on staying level-headed while buildings collapsed around him somehow ended up being treated by his own son as the reckless one making impulsive decisions in his own kitchen. I'm not, by any honest measure, an impulsive man. I've been married to my wife, Barbara, for 38 years. We raised our son, Danny, and our daughter, Kristen, in the same house the entire time, and I retired at 62 with a pension, a paid-off house, and a genuinely boring, well-planned retirement strategy that Barbara and I had been discussing seriously for close to a decade before I actually pulled the trigger on it. The plan itself was straightforward and frankly a little dull to hear described out loud, which is exactly why it never once occurred to Barbara or me that anyone could later mistake it for anything resembling a crisis. Barbara and I had visited Mexico's Pacific coast twice on vacation over the years, once to Puerto Vallarta and once, more memorably, to a smaller surf town called Puerto Escondido on the Oaxaca coast, and both times had come home talking seriously about what an actual retirement there might look like rather than just a week's vacation. We ran the numbers the way I'd run any operational plan for 30 years, carefully with contingencies, checking healthcare access, researching the visa process, comparing our pension and Social Security against a realistic cost of living, and by the time we actually decided to make the move, we'd been planning it, deliberately and unremarkably, for the better part of 3 years. We kept a shared spreadsheet, the same way Barbara and I had kept household budgets our entire marriage, updating it quarterly with new research, new cost estimates, new questions we'd answer before moving to the next stage, a process so methodical that Barbara joked more than once it resembled one of my old incident action plans more than a retirement decision. We told both kids about the general direction early on, mentioning it casually at holidays over the first 2 years. And I genuinely believe, looking back, that the sheer ordinariness of how we discussed it, calm dinner table conversation rather than any dramatic announcement, is part of why neither of them fully registered how close we actually were to executing the plan until the specific details started arriving all at once in that final stretch. Here's where it gets genuinely funny, at least in hindsight. In the roughly 4 months leading up to our actual move, several entirely unrelated, entirely mundane changes in my life happened to overlap in a way that, viewed from a distance by a worried 41-year-old son who wasn't in the room for any of the actual reasoning behind them, looked exactly like a textbook midlife crisis checklist. I want to walk through Danny's actual list, item by item, because I think it's a genuinely useful lesson in how easily a normal, well-reasoned life change can get misread by someone who loves you but isn't seeing the full picture, especially when that someone is piecing the evidence together secondhand, through occasional phone calls and Barbara's offhand mentions at family dinners, rather than watching the actual months-long, entirely logical sequence of decisions unfold in real time the way Barbara and I had. Item 1 on Danny's list, in his own words, Red lost 22 pounds suddenly. The actual explanation was considerably less dramatic than sudden. Mexico's temporary resident visa process requires a medical exam as part of the application, and my doctor, reviewing my numbers ahead of that appointment, told me plainly that my blood pressure and cholesterol needed real attention before I hit my mid-60s, visa or no visa. I'd started a genuinely boring diet and walking routine 5 months before the move, for the extremely unglamorous reason that my doctor told me to, cutting out the specific late-night snacking habit I'd carried since decades of overnight shifts, walking 3 miles most mornings the same disciplined way I used to log my required physical fitness hours at the station. And the fact that it happened to coincide with our relocation timeline was coincidence, not crisis. Barbara actually joined me on most of those walks, which meant Danny's own mother could have corrected the entire narrative in about 30 seconds had he simply asked her directly, instead of building a list in isolation. Item 2, grew a beard out of nowhere. I want to comment down below and ask, honestly, how many of you have grown a beard for a genuinely mundane reason and had someone in your life read enormous significance into it anyway? Mine was simple. I'd shaved every single morning for 30 years as part of a fire department grooming standard that required a clean-shaven face for a proper respirator seal. A regulation I understood and respected but genuinely never enjoyed complying with, particularly on the coldest Cincinnati mornings of my career. The moment I retired, I stopped, purely because I finally could, the same way plenty of retired servicemen and firefighters do, watching decades of mandatory grooming habits fall away the instant the requirement disappeared. Barbara actually likes it, tells me it makes me look distinguished rather than the exhausted version of myself she remembers from decades of overnight shifts. Danny apparently found it alarming, associating a beard, I can only assume, with some vague cultural image of a man reinventing himself, rather than simply enjoying the specific freedom of no longer needing a razor every morning. Item 3, bought a motorcycle. This one, I'll admit, sounds worse out of context than it actually was. It wasn't a Harley. It was a modest 150cc scooter, the exact kind of practical local transportation half the expat community in Puerto Escondido actually uses. Purchased 6 weeks before our move specifically, because I'd read enough about the town's narrow streets and limited parking to know a full-sized car would be more burden than benefit. I'd researched the specific model extensively, cross-referencing forum posts from other American retirees in the area, the same methodical research process I'd apply to any equipment purchase. And I'd even taken a weekend safety course back in Ohio before we left, hardly the profile of a man having an impulsive crisis. Danny apparently pictured something considerably more dramatic when Barbara mentioned it offhand at a family dinner. Some vision, I gathered later, involving leather and an open highway, rather than the actual reality of a retired man puttering carefully through narrow cobblestone streets at 20 miles an hour. Item 4, signed up for surfing lessons. This one, I'll admit, is the item Barbara and I actually laughed about the most once we understood how it had landed. Puerto Escondido is genuinely one of the premier surf destinations in Mexico, the town's Zicatela break famous enough that serious surfers travel from around the world specifically for it. And Barbara, not me, was the one who first suggested we both try a beginner lesson during our final scouting trip, purely as something new we could learn together in our new home, rather than any kind of personal reinvention on my part. I want to be honest that I was terrible at it, fell off the board more times in that first lesson than I could count, swallowed what felt like a genuinely alarming quantity of the Pacific Ocean, and came home with a bruise on my hip, that Barbara still brings up whenever I complain about anything else. Our instructor, a patient young local named Toms, who's since become something of a friend, told us afterward that we were, without question, the most enthusiastically bad students he'd taught all season. A compliment I choose to interpret generously. Item 5, the one that apparently tipped Danny over into actually scheduling that kitchen table conversation, read, "Simply bought new clothes. Seems different." The clothes were lightweight, warm climate items appropriate for a coastal town that regularly hits 90 degrees, purchased to replace a closet full of Ohio winter gear that would have been genuinely useless in Oaxaca. Linen shirts and quick dry shorts I'd researched with the same practical thoroughness I once applied to selecting turnout gear. As for seeming different, I'll grant him that one entirely. I did seem different, because for the first time in 30 years I wasn't operating on 24-hour shifts, wasn't carrying the specific low-grade vigilance that fire service leaves permanently wired into you, the particular way your ears stay tuned for an alarm tone even years after the alarm itself stops being relevant to your life. A genuinely relaxed version of a man Danny had only ever known as tightly wound probably did look, from the outside, like some kind of transformation, when really it was closer to the opposite, simply the removal of 30 years of accumulated professional tension, rather than the addition of anything new. The actual kitchen table conversation happened on a Sunday, Danny arriving with his list already prepared on his phone, Kristen joining by video call from Denver, both of them clearly having coordinated beforehand, both of them approaching the whole thing with genuine love and genuine worry, rather than any kind of judgment, which I want to be fair about even while telling this story for laughs. Danny opened by saying, carefully, that he'd noticed some things over the past few months and wanted to check in, a phrase so clearly rehearsed that Barbara later admitted she'd had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling at the sheer earnestness of it. He read through his list, and I noticed myself, without fully deciding to, falling into the exact same calm, methodical briefing posture I used to take with a nervous rookie crew before a difficult call, walking through each item on his list one at a time, explaining the boring reason behind it, watching his expression shift, item by item, from genuine concern toward a specific kind of embarrassed relief. Somewhere around item 3, Danny actually stopped me and asked, half laughing already, whether there was anything else on his list that had an equally boring explanation, and I told him honestly that as far as I could tell, every single thing he'd noticed traced back to either a doctor's recommendation, a practical logistics decision, or his own mother's idea, none of which had involved a single moment of the kind of identity crisis he'd apparently been picturing. Images I gathered later had involved everything from a secret second family to some kind of eat, pray, love style reinvention. His sister had apparently floated as a genuine possibility during one of their coordinating phone calls. Kristen on the video call asked if I'd been talking to anyone, a specific therapist-adjacent phrase I recognized instantly from her own psychology background. And I told her, gently, that the person I'd been talking to most consistently through this entire planning process was her mother, sitting right next to me, the same person either of them could have simply called at any point over the preceding 3 years to ask directly what was actually going on. By the time I got to the surfing lessons, Danny was laughing, and by the time I finished explaining the scooter, Kristen on the video call was laughing hard enough that Danny had to ask her to repeat what she'd said. Barbara, who'd been sitting quietly through most of it, finally spoke up and told both kids with the specific dry delivery she's perfected over 38 years of marriage to me, that if they wanted to worry about an actual midlife crisis, they should have seen the year I turned 40, when I genuinely did buy an ill-advised used motorcycle and rode it exactly twice before admitting it terrified me, a story neither Danny nor Kristen had ever heard, and that effectively ended the entire intervention in a fit of family laughter. I want to comment down below and ask if any of you have had your own family misread a perfectly reasonable decision as some kind of crisis, because I suspect this particular dynamic, adult kids projecting their own anxiety about aging parents onto entirely mundane changes, happens far more often than anyone actually talks about. We moved to Puerto Escondido 5 months later, settling in the Zicatela neighborhood, close enough to the famous surf break that I can watch far more talented surfers than myself from our small terrace most mornings while I drink coffee. Danny visited us 3 months after we settled in, genuinely curious now rather than worried, and I watched him walk through our house, modest, comfortable, entirely unremarkable in the way I'd always promised him it would be. No evidence anywhere of the crisis he'd half expected to find. He inspected the place, I'll admit, with a specific thoroughness that made both Barbara and me laugh once we noticed it, checking the water pressure, asking about the electrical setup, behaving for about an hour like he was conducting his own version of the safety inspections I used to perform on job sites, before finally, visibly, relaxing once he'd satisfied himself that his parents hadn't landed somewhere genuinely precarious. I took him out on the scooter myself, weaving carefully through the narrow streets down to a beach called Carrizalillo, and he admitted, watching me navigate it competently, that the whole thing looked considerably less alarming in person than it had sounded assembled into a list on his phone. We stopped for fish tacos at a small stand along the way, run by a family Barbara and I had gotten to know over our first few months, and Danny sat there eating, watching me chat comfortably in the basic Spanish I'd been slowly building since our arrival, and told me, half joking, that he genuinely hadn't pictured his father as someone who'd casually order lunch in a second language. One more small piece of evidence, I gathered, that had quietly undermined the crisis narrative he'd originally constructed. He tried the surfing himself that same trip, with the same instructor Barbara and I had used, and fell off his board considerably more often than I had, a fact Barbara has not once let either of us forget since. Sitting on the beach that evening, watching Danny nurse a bruised ego alongside his own bruised hip, he told me, more seriously, that he thought he'd been so focused on watching for signs of his father slowing down or falling apart that he'd genuinely failed to recognize what actual health and happiness looked like when they showed up instead, mistaking contentment for crisis simply because it arrived wrapped in changes he hadn't personally witnessed happen gradually. He apologized, a little awkwardly, for the whole kitchen table intervention, and I told him there was nothing to apologize for, that a son worried enough about his father to actually show up and ask questions, however clumsily assembled into a list, was doing something considerably more right than most adult children manage to do at all. I think about that kitchen table conversation often now, sitting on our terrace most evenings watching surfers I'll never be skilled enough to match. Barbara beside me, both of us considerably more relaxed than either of our kids probably pictured us being at this stage of life. 30 years of fire service taught me to read genuine danger accurately, structural collapse, flashover conditions, the specific signs that separate a survivable situation from an unsurvivable one. It turns out reading your own aging parents accurately is its own separate skill entirely, one Danny's still learning, and one I suspect most adult children eventually have to learn the same way he did, by actually showing up and seeing the full picture instead of assembling a list from a distance. Kristen visited a few months after Danny did, arriving with her own version of watchful skepticism that dissolved considerably faster than her brother's had. Mostly, I think, because Danny had already called her from the beach that first trip and told her in his own words that their father had simply gotten happier and more relaxed than either of them had ever actually seen him growing up, and that whatever list either of them had been keeping needed to be quietly retired for good. She spent a week with us, tried the surfing lessons herself with markedly more natural ability than either Danny or me, a fact she has mentioned at every family gathering since, and left telling Barbara that she finally understood why we'd chosen this specific stretch of coast over the more polished, more expected retirement destinations either of us could have picked instead. I keep Danny's original list, screenshotted, in a folder on my phone now, mostly as a running joke between us, though I'll admit there's something else underneath the joke that I think about more seriously, something closer to genuine gratitude than amusement most days I actually revisit it. 30 years of running toward other people's emergencies teaches you plenty about recognizing danger. It doesn't teach you much at all about recognizing your own children's specific, well-intentioned anxiety about watching their parents age. A concern that has nothing to do with judgment and everything to do with love expressed in the only slightly clumsy way a worried 41-year-old son could figure out how to express it. A spreadsheet of concerns instead of a simple phone call. Because sometimes love shows up looking exactly like an intervention, even when what it actually needed to be was just a question. I'm Donald Foster. Thank you for listening to Retired in Mexico.